What's your creepiest, most unnerving story? Story 1. In the late 1970s, my uncle was studying medicine at the University of Chicago. After a morning class, he decided that he would hitchhike back home to Lincoln Park on the north side instead of paying for a taxi. A man drove up in a Plymouth Satellite and offered my uncle a ride. The man looked normal and seemed friendly, light-hearted even, so my uncle got in the car and they started driving toward Lakeshore Drive. However, once they got there, the man drove south on Lakeshore instead of north toward Lincoln Park. My uncle told the man he was going the wrong way and to turn around and head north. The man looked at my uncle, put his hand on his knee and said, "No, son, you are coming with me," and smiled darkly at him. My uncle froze in panic, and when they hit traffic near the South Shore, he quickly unlocked the passenger door and ran away without looking back. A year or two later, on a cold December day, my uncle was having coffee in a cafe with my future aunt when he caught something on the television that made his blood run cold. He saw the man who had picked him up from school the year before. He had been arrested for the suspected assault and killing of over 20 young men and boys. The man on the television was John Wayne Gacy, and he had removed the door handle from the passenger's side door to prevent the men he picked up from escaping. Story 2. A man went to a hotel and walked up to the front desk to check in. The woman at the desk gave him his key and told him that, on the way to his room, there was a door with no number that was locked, and no one was allowed in there. She said especially that no one should look inside the room under any circumstances. He followed the instructions of the woman at the front desk, went straight to his room, and went to bed. The next night, his curiosity would not leave him alone about the room with no number on the door. He walked down the hall to the door and tried the handle, and sure enough, it was locked. He bent down and looked through the wide keyhole. Cold air passed through it, chilling his eye. What he saw was a hotel bedroom like his, and in the corner was a woman whose skin was completely white. She was leaning her head against the wall, facing away from the door. He stared in confusion for a while and almost knocked on the door out of curiosity, but decided not to. This hesitation saved his life. He crept away from the door and walked back to his room. The next day he returned to the door and looked through the wide keyhole again. This time all he saw was redness. He could not make anything out besides a distinct red color, unmoving. Perhaps the inhabitant of the room knew he had been watching the night before and had blocked the keyhole with something red. At this point he decided to consult the woman at the front desk for more information. She sighed and said, "Did you look through the keyhole?" The man told her that he had, and she said, "Well, I might as well tell you the story. A long time ago, a man ended his wife's life in that room, and her ghost haunts it. But these people were not ordinary. They were white all over, except for their eyes, which were red." Story 3. My 4-year-old daughter was supposedly asleep when I heard noises coming from her upstairs bedroom. I tried to listen, but could not make out what was being said. I approached the room and she stopped talking. Thinking I had alarmed her, I went into the room. At the time, she was sharing it with her 3-year-old sister. I walked in and saw the 4-year-old sitting up in bed. I smiled and asked if everything was okay. She said yes, but her sister said they were keeping her awake. I asked who, and my 4-year-old said she was sorry, but that she had been talking. When I asked her who she was talking to, my 3-year-old sat up and said, "The girl in the window. She said you were coming." After being completely shocked, I asked who the girl was, and they both said a girl comes and stands in front of the window at night and talks to them. Not knowing what to say, I said okay, tucked them in, and stayed outside their door for a while. The next day I asked about the girl, and they said she came back but was mad. I waited a few days and asked again, and my 4-year-old said the girl in the window was still mad. I forgot about it for about a week when my wife asked who the girls were talking to upstairs. Alarmed, I ran upstairs and both girls were sitting under the window looking up. They turned and looked at me and asked if I wanted to meet the girl. When they turned back around, disappointed, they said the girl had left. It has been about 5 years since then, and I have not heard about the girl in the window again. Story 4. During high school, Mark was over at his friend's house. We will just call him Steve because I do not know his real name. They were hanging out in Steve's room after just putting up a poster of Limp Bizkit's Significant Other album cover that Steve had just bought. Minutes later, Steve's dad came by and ordered him to take the poster down immediately. When Steve asked his dad why, he said never mind the reason and to just listen and do it. Steve was angry but listened to his dad and took it down. Later, Steve asked his dad why he told him to remove the poster, and this is the story his dad told him. When I was young, your aunt, uncles, and I all had to sleep on the floor in one room because we were very poor. One night, someone walked into the room, bent over my head, and asked me to give him my soul. I was so afraid that I pretended to be asleep. This thing would ask me to give him my soul a few times and then get up and walk out of the room. This happened every other night until I reached my early teens. One night after he walked away, I opened my eyes and saw his face. What I saw was something with the body of a human, wearing a hood, and under the hood was the face of a lizard. A few years before you were born, we threw a Halloween party at our house with all of our family. We ran out of candy, so I drove to the local market to get more. On the way, I was listening to the radio, and they said to call in with your scariest story. I pulled over, used a public phone, and told the story of the lizard man on the air. When I got back home, I heard someone crying. I went upstairs and saw my sister crying on the bed. I asked her what was wrong, and she said, "I heard you on the radio. That happened to me too." Story 5. One school day, a boy named Tom was sitting in class doing math. It was 6 more minutes until after school. As he was working, something caught his eye. His desk was next to the window, and he turned and looked at the grass outside, where he saw something that looked like a picture. When school was over, he ran to the spot where he had seen it, moving fast so no one else could grab it. He picked it up and smiled. It was a picture of the most beautiful girl he had ever seen. She wore a dress with tights and red shoes, and her hand was formed into a peace sign. She was so beautiful that he wanted to meet her, so he ran all over the school asking everyone if they knew her or had ever seen her before. But everyone said no, and he was devastated. When he got home, he asked his older sister if she knew the girl, but she also said no. It was very late, so Tom went upstairs, placed the picture on his bedside table, and fell asleep. In the middle of the night, Tom was awakened by a tapping on his window, like a nail tapping. After the tapping, he heard a giggle. He saw a shadow near the window, got out of bed, opened the window, and followed the giggling. But by the time he reached it, it was gone. The next day, he again asked his neighbors if they knew her, and everyone said no. When his mother came home, he asked her too, and she said no. He went to his room, placed the picture on his desk, and fell asleep. Once again, he was awakened by tapping. He took the picture and followed the giggling across the road, when suddenly he was hit by a car. He passed away with the picture in his hand. The driver got out and tried to help, but it was too late. Suddenly, he noticed the picture, picked it up, and saw a cute girl holding up 3 fingers. Story 6. I have an odd habit a friend recently picked up on, a habit I developed about a year ago. He noticed that when I enter a room, any room, and shut the door, I turn my face away from it and close my eyes until I hear the lock click, and only after the door is fully closed do I open them. He used to give me a hard time about it until I told him where it started. I work for a water seal company in St. Paul, producing sealant for exposed wood, decks, boats, that kind of thing. You hear about sealant being a dirty word in the Ashland, Icor Falls, Ironton area, but not all those companies were part of the infamous Ethyler summer that wiped out the local economy in the 1950s. I was sent on business to an industrial park outside of Icor Falls and checked into a dismal hotel called the Hotel Umbra, which looked like the decor had not been changed since 1930. The lobby wallpaper had turned yellow from decades of cigarette smoke, and everything had a fine layer of dust, including the old man behind the front desk. My room was on the 4th floor, and the hotel had an old cable elevator with double doors, a flexing metal gate inside, and a solid outer pair. I latched the gate, pressed the tiny black button, and just as the outer doors were closing, I was startled by the face of a young woman rushing toward the gap. She was too late, the doors shut, and the elevator ascended. I thought nothing of it until I needed to go back down for one of my bags. As the doors nearly closed again, the same thing happened, her face moving toward the gap, staring through the gate, too late to stop the doors. This time I lunged forward and held the door open button until the doors slid back. No one was there. No footsteps. No open rooms. Nothing. I stood directly in front of the gap as the doors closed again, and in a fraction of a second, several fingertips appeared, followed by her face rushing in from around the corner. She looked about 13 years old, pale, plain, with dark brown neck-length hair and a glassy expression touched with quiet desperation, the kind that seems to silently ask for help. When I asked the old man at the desk about her, he calmly told me I had met young Maddie, who had been there a long time, shy, silent, curious, and fond of gentlemen guests. He said she only liked to look. I stayed 3 nights, though it was meant to be 4, and tried sleeping in my car the last night, but it did not help. After that, I saw Maddie everywhere. Every door I closed, every drawer, every cabinet, every closet, she appeared in the narrowing gap for less than a second, retreating the moment I saw her, never touching the door, never making a sound. I even saw her rush from inside a desk drawer, her wide eyes pleading, before I tore the drawer out and threw it aside. Back in my car, she appeared in mirrors over the hood, once upside down at the top of the windshield. I have been back home for a year now, but she has not stopped. If I watch any space long enough, my eye will catch movement just in time to see her eye slip away. There is never anything there when I look directly, so I stopped looking. I close my eyes when I shut doors, drawers, cabinets, refrigerators, coolers, and the trunk of my car. Only the space is big enough. That used to work until a few nights ago. Standing in front of my bathroom mirror, everything closed, watching myself floss, when I opened my mouth wide and swear I saw fingertips retreat down the back of my throat. Story 7. About 2 years ago, I had a roommate who told me this story. She used to work at a hotel in her hometown, a smaller city farther north. Many of the girls she worked with were also in high school, and some of them were very openly promiscuous. One weekend, one of her coworkers, whom we will call Lindsay, had an intimate encounter with a guy at a house party. A day or two later, while at work, Lindsay noticed a rash developing around her mouth. She shrugged it off, hoping it would go away, but after a couple of days it became much worse. She finally decided to see a doctor. The doctor could not identify it just by looking, so he took samples and told her he would call once the test results came back. Later that same day, the doctor called Lindsay and told her she needed to come back to the hospital immediately. When she returned, the doctor said she needed to explain what she had been doing, because what she had around her mouth was something typically contracted from deceased individuals. It turned out that the family of the man she had been with owned a funeral home, and the man had been engaging in inappropriate acts with bodies. The funeral home was later shut down. Story 8. I was in Taiwan one year when I was younger and had traveled to a busy night market, one of those popular evening gatherings. Nearby, I noticed a sign for a net cafe in a building that was about 5 or 6 stories tall. Thinking I would quickly check my email, I walked into the dark, narrow entrance of the building. It was old and poorly maintained, but that was not unusual for the area. Inside was a dim hallway that led to a small elevator. I pressed the call button and stepped inside. The elevator looked surprisingly new compared to the rest of the building, but I did not think much of it. Like many buildings there was no fourth floor listed because the number 4 is associated with death, so the panel showed 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6. I found the button for the net cafe on the 6th floor and pressed it. The elevator began ascending quietly. When it stopped, I assumed I had arrived and instinctively stepped forward. But what I saw outside made me freeze. The floor was completely dark, lit only by the elevator light, and looked abandoned for decades, with furniture covered in white sheets. Since the building was small and each floor was single occupancy, I could see nearly the entire space. Thinking I had stopped at the wrong floor, I checked the indicator lights, but none were lit, even though the button for the net cafe was still glowing. All of this happened within seconds. Then I noticed a figure moving slowly in the distance, barely visible, shaped like a person wearing a long gown and heading toward the elevator. Panicked, I pressed the door close button, and the elevator light suddenly flickered off. I was terrified. Less than a second later, the lights came back on, the doors closed, and the elevator resumed moving. Moments later, it opened to the net cafe floor, and I stepped out, extremely relieved. After calming down, I told the cashier what I had seen, and her face turned pale. She explained that while she had never experienced it herself, Co-workers and customers had reported similar incidents. The building originally had 6 floors, and the fourth floor once housed a hair salon. An employee had ended her life there by cutting her wrists over a wash station. Afterward, strange things happened, such as water appearing red during hair washes and figures appearing in mirrors, and the salon eventually closed. No business wanted to rent the fourth floor afterward, even at very low prices. A stationery supply store eventually tried, but renovations were plagued by unexplained accidents, including tools moving on their own, mirrors shattering, and a worker injuring his hand when the elevator doors closed unexpectedly. The workers refused to continue, the business left, and the owner permanently shut down the floor. The elevator was reprogrammed so it could never stop there and did not even have a button for it. Yet despite that, sometimes the elevator still stops on that floor, the doors open, and people see a figure moving in the darkness. Just like I did. Story 9. I never really put much stock into the concept of ghosts or the supernatural in general. My mother is an alcoholic and a self-described psychic, so it was always easy for me to take my personal experience with her and apply it to the entire spectrum. I would roll my eyes so hard at the mere mention of spirits that you would think they were about to fall out of my head. About 10 years ago, a friend and I were walking through a park on the way back to his house. It was a shortcut, which made it appealing when you had to be home by a certain time, and it ran along the water, which made it rather scenic. We fancied ourselves teenage philosophers and usually had long-winded conversations about how we were going to change the world, though in hindsight we did not even notice when it changed us instead. To explain what happened, I need to describe the park. It was a long, curving path branching off a larger one called the Galloping Goose Trail, circling a small inlet of water along the gorge. As you walked uphill, the lights lining the trail stopped just before the woods began, except for one final light standing alone on the hill, like a beacon or lighthouse. Beyond that, the path continued through dense trees, crested a hill, and descended again. At one point, you could see a broken-down house peering through the trees, but otherwise you never felt far from civilization, even though it felt that way. After sunset, the park became foreboding and intensely dark. As we were walking uphill that night, something we had done many times before, the final light along the trail flickered and went out. I found it strange but not worth mentioning. We continued into the darkness, and as we came down the hill on the other side, we heard a noise. It was impossibly loud and seemed to move. My rational mind immediately tried to explain it, and I assumed it was a helicopter flying low. But as it drew closer and the sound became clearer, my heart sank. Suddenly it was all around us, a thunderous roar. I looked up and saw the trees completely still, silhouetted against the evening sky. Then I heard voices, not a handful, but hundreds, maybe thousands, blended into a single distorted sound of speaking, whispering, and screaming. I could not distinguish words, but I knew exactly what I was hearing, and it was horrifying. The sound faded and moved away from us. We looked at each other without saying a word, turned around and walked back, not running but moving with undeniable urgency. When we reached the main road, I completely lost control. I could not explain what we had heard, and it terrified me because there was nothing I could confront or fight. That feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. I asked him if he heard it too, and he only nodded. We later tried to investigate, thinking it might calm us to find a rational explanation. We learned that the only major tragedy our town had ever experienced was a bridge collapse, and that bodies had been recovered along the same shoreline we walked that night. The abandoned house we had seen through the trees gave me such a strong sense of dread that we did not stay long when we visited it. There were piles of rotting lumber everywhere, remnants of a failed renovation attempt we found listed in city records. Though information about the house itself was scarce, we eventually discovered it was because the house had been moved from another part of town after a fire. I avoided that park after that. Mostly. A few months later, I was there again with my girlfriend, retelling the story with exaggerated enthusiasm as we began walking uphill. I told her we would be fine as long as the light did not go out, though I still do not know why I said that. As if on cue, it did. She grabbed my arm and insisted we leave immediately. I stood there staring at the dead light, stunned when I started seeing things. Maybe it was a trick of the darkness, but the shadows of the trees appeared to circle around us. I have never seen anything like it before, or since. I never went back into that park after dark again. Story 10. This happened when I was about 5 or 6, and it has stayed vividly clear in my mind ever since. I never figured out whether it was real or just an extremely intense night terror. I was lying there reading my Sesame Street book, all cozy in my bunk bed, with my siblings and parents fast asleep, leaving only me and my imagination awake. I was a nerdy little bookworm who read whenever I could not sleep, which was almost every night. But that particular night something felt wrong. As I lay there reading by the moonlight streaming through my bedroom window, I realized how cold the room had become. Trying to keep warm, I set my book down and pulled my quilts up toward my chin. The book slid and fell into the crack between the wall and my bed. So without thinking, I reached down to grab it. As I pulled the book upward, I felt a slight tug on the end of it, as if something were resisting me. I pulled back, and it pulled back. I pulled again, and this time it pulled back harder. In the darkness, I caught a brief glimpse of what looked like a hand, and my eyes widened in terror. Suddenly, every scary story I had ever heard felt like it might be true. I hesitated, torn between trying to get my book back and the fear that something terrible was about to happen, and finally I let go. The book dropped to the hardwood floor with a heavy thud, and I heard a scraping sound under my bed, like nails dragged across a chalkboard. I lay frozen, not moving an inch, only darting my eyes toward my sister sleeping in the bed several feet away, hearing nothing but her soft breathing and the quiet sleep sounds of my younger brother above me. The next morning, convinced it had all been my imagination, I crawled under the bed to retrieve my book, only to find it completely gone. All that remained was a deep scratch in the floor where the book should have been. After that, for years, I only read in my brightly lit closet with the door closed and a pile of blankets around me. Story 11. When I was about 10 years old, we lived in an old rental house while the home my parents still live in was being built. One night, I could not sleep and lay awake in bed when I heard rustling in the dining room, assuming one of my parents was up. I rolled onto my side and looked toward the wall, only to see the form of someone crouched beside my bed, their head level with mine. When I made eye contact, the figure tilted its head, though I could see no eyes, and despite light coming through the window, no light touched it, leaving only a black, featureless human shape outlined against the wall. Terrified to scream, I rolled away and stayed awake all night, only turning back in the morning to find it gone, and my parents later told me they had slept through the night. About 4 years later, after we had moved into the new house, I was outside cleaning up toys one evening and bounced a basketball as I walked up the driveway. When I looked up, I froze, seeing the same featureless figure crouched on the edge of the roof gutter only a short distance away. It stood, turned, and calmly walked up the steep roof without a sound before disappearing, and I never saw it again. Another story comes from my grandmother's childhood in a house in Jeffrey, West Virginia, where she and her siblings repeatedly heard heavy footsteps on the roof at night that stopped whenever their parents woke up, until one night the sounds were loud enough for their father to hear. He went outside with a gun but found nothing, and the noises never returned, though a neighbor later claimed to have seen something standing on the roof that night. One final story involves my best friend's grandfather, whose second wife often claimed to see strange beings at night, something he never believed until one evening when she calmly woke him and asked if he believed her now. He saw a dark, robed figure in the corner of the room with a human body and an animal-like head he could never properly describe, and when he shouted, it vanished like vapor, after which he eventually left her. Story 12. I married my college sweetheart right after graduation, but about a year later the marriage was failing, and it seemed best for me to move out. My older brother owned a large but neglected house on the other side of town and was planning to sell it, so he let me stay there while I got back on my feet. Since he was rarely home, I spent evenings and weekends fixing the place, repainting rooms, repairing floors, and renovating both bathrooms, with him paying for materials while I did the work myself. The final room I worked on was a bedroom with a built-in wardrobe, and I decided to paint the inside as well. Late one Friday night, I finished the cupboard and left the doors open to dry. The next day, while preparing to paint the walls, I tripped entering the room, and a paintbrush flew into the cupboard, leaving a long, strange mark shaped like an elongated letter with a line running downward. Annoyed, I jokingly turned the mark into words, eventually forming the phrase, "Satan orders you to kill," assuming I would paint over it anyway. The next day I bought more paint and covered it, but the message still seemed faintly visible, so over the next week I kept repainting it, convinced I could still see it even though my brother later insisted there was nothing there. During this time, potential buyers toured the house. Eventually I moved away, my brother sold the house, and life went on. That Christmas, while visiting him in his new apartment, he admitted the house had always unsettled him, then revealed the final detail. The family who bought it, including a teenage son, later committed a violent act, and the parents' bodies were hidden inside a cupboard. Story 13. My good friend, who I will call Andrew for privacy, had been talking online for almost a year with a girl from the United Kingdom named Lily. She seemed cute, kind, and well-adjusted, with lots of friends and a loving family. Lily had hundreds of photos, stories, and what looked like a completely real life. Her friends and family regularly commented on her MySpace page, talking about weekends together, missed calls, birthday wishes, and plans to hang out soon. Over time, Andrew developed deep feelings for Lily. He told his parents about her and then his close friends. He bought countless phone cards and called her whenever it worked for both of them. About 9 months in, Lily said she was interested in moving to the United States to be closer to Andrew, and there was even talk of living together. She told Andrew she had spoken to her parents, who suggested she visit first with a friend before committing to the move. Andrew was ecstatic and spent weeks talking about how amazing Lily was and how she would be visiting for a week so everyone could meet her. When Andrew went to the airport to pick up Lily and her friend, Lily never arrived. Instead, he met two people who called themselves Jenny and Sam, who claimed to be siblings. They explained that Lily had panicked at the last minute about flying overseas to meet Andrew and had switched her ticket with Sam. Jenny and Sam said their job was to see if Andrew was who he claimed to be and to check out the town. When Andrew got home, Lily spent hours apologizing online, and he reassured her, saying he understood her fear. I met Jenny and Sam at a party soon after. Andrew brought them everywhere, trying hard to impress them so they would report good things back to Lily. They seemed completely normal, stuck close together, drank beer, joked, and talked with everyone. The only odd thing was how many photos they took, but we assumed it was for Lily. A few days before they left, they told Andrew the truth, or at least what they claimed was the truth. Their names were not Jenny and Sam, they were not related, and Lily did not exist. Lily was actually someone named Alicia, and every photo on Lily's profile had been taken from Alicia's MySpace page. The friends and family were real people from Alicia's life, just renamed, and all the comments were fabricated by fake accounts. Alicia had no idea any of this existed and had never heard of Andrew. They also showed Andrew a fake profile made for him with a look-alike named Justin or something similar who had Andrew's real friends and family under different names. They said this was a long-running game involving at least 20 people around the world. Then they showed Andrew a book, and this is what truly terrified me. It was a detailed book documenting Andrew's life. Every piece of information he had ever shared with Lily was recorded, including chat excerpts, photos, descriptions of friends, and extensive footnotes cross-referencing relationships, friendships, bands, and family ties with page numbers, linking everything together. It was an enormous web of interconnected personal data about our entire social circle. Jenny and Sam admitted they took photos during their visit to update the book and the online profiles. Andrew kept the book and refused to give it back, then kicked them out. He was devastated. Later, Lily messaged him again online. Andrew confronted her, saying he knew she was not real and wanted to know why this had been done. Lily never replied. She vanished completely. Andrew never got answers. I saw the book before Andrew shredded it and burned it. Story 14. When I was young, anything related to archaeology thrilled me. My mom would take me to the library to work on small research projects or finish homework, and I would secretly slip old issues of National Geographic into my books, reading articles about dead civilizations, excavated tombs and cities, and their beliefs and superstitions whenever she was not looking. When my birthday came around the following year, and my parents asked what I wanted, I confidently asked for books about archaeology. And a few days later, I received three large, heavy books about ancient societies from North America, South America, and the Caribbean. It was not what I expected, since I thought I had clearly asked for ancient Greece and Egypt. But it was still fascinating and focused on these cultures and the archaeological work done on them. At around 10 years old, I was very interested in female anatomy, and one of the books contained an image of a dark stone figurine of a pregnant woman with exaggerated features missing its head. On the adjacent page was a photograph of a pregnant tribeswoman with the suggestion that the figurine represented women like her. I kept comparing the two images, and the absence of the figurine's head began to deeply unsettle me. Eventually, it disturbed me enough that I skipped those pages entirely during later readings. As I grew older, my interest in archaeology faded, and those books ended up donated to the local library as I moved on to fantasy, science fiction, and role-playing games. Several years later, my parents took me to a bed and breakfast owned by friends of my mother for my 16th birthday. The estate consisted of a main house, a carriage house, and another smaller home about 50 yards away, all surrounded by apple orchards, despite being near a main road. And the buildings were about 150 years old. The staff was friendly and relaxed, and one cook named Serene stood out to me. She was a thin, attractive black woman with a thick island accent, a contagious laugh, and a habit of staring toward the orchard as if lost in thought. After a few days, I grew bored and asked if I could explore the orchard. My mother's friend agreed but warned me to return before sunset because of coyotes. I eagerly explored for hours but found nothing of interest, though I did notice coyote tracks in one flattened area between two apple trees where the grass and soil were worn bare. On my way back, slightly lost, I ran into Serene, who was humming a lullaby. She told me it was a Caribbean song used to calm restless spirits. As we talked, she explained that the spirits around the property were unsettled and had been bothering her since she arrived, especially at night, because women in her family were sensitive to such things. When I jokingly asked if there were spirits with us at that moment, her expression turned serious, and she warned me that knowing how many would make me want to leave immediately. When I mentioned the flattened area in the orchard, she looked uneasy and advised me not to return there, saying the orchard held many curious things. We reached the house just as the sun was setting. The following day, we spent time in town doing tourist activities, but my mind kept returning to the orchard and that one strange spot. That night, as darkness fell, we could hear coyotes howling in the distance. Story 15. This story was told to me by a girl I recently moved in with, and when she told it to me, it sent chills down my spine. It happened to her a few years earlier when she attended the biggest Irish horse racing event of the year, known as the Galway Races, which is essentially several days of heavy socializing, drinking, and gambling where the entire city takes part. People from all over the country travel to Galway, and because the city fills up quickly, many end up staying in rural areas outside town. She and a friend were staying in a small house on a narrow, secluded country lane. One night, after returning home very drunk, they realized they had no key to get inside. They sat down at the front of the house to rest and figure out what to do. She told me that at that exact moment, she was overcome with an intense feeling that something was wrong, and she instantly sobered up. The road was completely silent, with no streetlights, since it was not a main road. The two girls walked roughly 100 yards down the lane to the next house and knocked. After a few minutes, a neighbor answered and gave them a spare key. The girls returned to the house and went straight to bed. The next morning, they looked out the window and saw two police cars and police tape blocking off the narrow road. They spoke with the officers, who explained that a man walking home from the races had been struck by a car outside their house. It had been a hit and run, and the man had been left alive on the road throughout the night. The officers also said the accident had occurred before the time the girls arrived home, meaning they had been sitting just a few feet away from a dying man while resting on the doorstep, completely unaware. Story 16. I was incredibly excited to get my first apartment, which was located in an old antebellum house that had been divided into 4 separate units. It was a beautiful, unique place, but from the beginning something felt wrong. Every time I took a shower, I felt an overwhelming sense of unease, like someone was watching me. Soon after, the dream started. I repeatedly dreamed of an old woman wearing a pink nightgown. Sometimes she appeared fragile and gentle, calmly telling me that I should go with her, though she never said where. Other times the dreams were horrifying, with her eye sockets empty, her hair greasy and falling out, and her mouth twisted into a silent scream as she clawed at the air trying to grab me. The longer I lived there, the more aggressive and disturbing the dreams became, and the stronger the feeling of being watched grew, especially in the shower. By the time we moved out, I could not close my eyes while showering, gripped by a powerful fear that something terrible would happen if I did. After moving out, I mentioned all of this to a friend who had recently moved into a house across the street, trying to laugh it off. He told me that another friend of his had lived in the apartment above mine years earlier, and that an elderly woman had died in the unit I had lived in. Apparently, no one ever stayed in that apartment for more than a couple of months. Not long after I left, the building burned down, and the fire started in my old apartment. The cause was never determined, and even now, thinking about it still unsettles me. Story 17. My great-grandmother was a hilarious Scottish woman, deeply superstitious, sharp-tongued, and famous for elaborate practical jokes. She had bright green eyes and a warm, radiant smile that could light up a room. One strange thing about her was that she constantly talked about seeing 11:11 throughout her life, which was odd considering digital clocks only existed toward the very end of her lifetime. Her daughter, my grandmother, my mother, and I all continued to see 11:11 almost daily. When I was 10 years old, my great-grandmother was in a nursing home, the kind with harsh lighting and an unsettling atmosphere. And I spent many hours there watching her slowly lose herself to dementia and Alzheimer's disease. Even during her decline, she continued to reference 11:11 with moments of startling clarity. Late one October, she slipped into a coma after several small strokes, and doctors told us there was no chance of recovery. On November 11th, in the late 1980s, we received a call saying she was nearing the end. I begged to come say goodbye, bringing the stuffed toy she had given me years earlier. That evening, as we held her hands and shared memories, she suddenly opened her eyes, squeezed my grandmother's hand, smiled with pure joy, and clearly said, "It's okay. It's okay." Moments later, the doctor confirmed she had passed away, and the recorded time of death was November 11th at 11:11 in the evening. At her wake that weekend, during a cold and stormy autumn day, the power suddenly went out while my great-aunt, who had always dismissed the 11:11 idea, was listening skeptically to the story. I checked my illuminated watch and saw the time, which left her completely shaken. My family still talks about this story often. It comforts some of them, unsettles others, and leaves me with a strange mix of unease and quiet wonder. Story 18. My grandparents lived on a farm in the middle of Nebraska. They had just gotten married, moved in together, and had their first baby, who was only a few months old and needed to be watched constantly. It was early morning and the cows needed to be milked, and my grandfather could not do the work alone, so my grandmother had to help. The task was quick, and the baby, my aunt, had been fed earlier and was sleeping peacefully, so they went together to the barn. After they finished, my grandmother headed back to the house while my grandfather stayed behind to finish chores. As she approached the house, she noticed the front door was ajar, slowly swinging in the wind. She told herself it was probably nothing, but she felt uneasy and called for my grandfather, who reluctantly came back with her. As they entered the house together, they heard the sound of a toilet finishing its flush. That alone was strange, but since farmhouses at the time often had unreliable plumbing, they tried to stay calm despite growing nervous. They hurried toward the cradle as my aunt began screaming. The ceiling light above the cradle was swinging violently, as if it had just been turned on. And when my grandmother picked up the baby, she noticed a single black hair on her white gown. Both of my grandparents had very light blonde hair, and there was no one else around who could have left it there. My grandmother became hysterical when my grandfather noticed the attic hatch swinging back and forth, as though someone had just climbed up into it. He stepped toward it, preparing to open it. But my grandmother threw herself at him, sobbing and begging him to leave immediately. She convinced him to grab the baby, get into the truck, and drive straight to town. Reluctantly, he agreed. They never discovered whether anyone had been in the house. About a week later, A man named Charlie Starkweather was captured less than 30 miles from their farm. At the time, he was believed to be one of the most dangerous criminals in the country. Story 19. There are small, beautiful hills outside Bangalore, India called Nandi Hills, a popular weekend getaway despite having little more than picnic spots and a few inns. The single-lane road leading there is poorly lit, full of potholes and cuts through dense, wooded areas. In the 1980s, a young couple decided to spend a weekend there. While driving up, they heard a radio alert about an inmate who had escaped from a nearby mental asylum, but they dismissed it and continued on their way. Partway up the road, their car ran out of fuel. The husband told his wife to stay in the car while he walked several miles to the nearest town to get help. She sat alone in the semi-darkness, with the windows up and doors locked, jumping at every shadow moving among the trees. 1 hour passed, then another, and there was still no sign of him. Suddenly, she heard a dull thump, then another, until it became a steady, rhythmic banging. To her horror, she realized it was coming from above her, something striking the roof of the car. Frozen in panic, she could not decide whether to run or stay. Then, to her relief, sirens sounded and flashing lights appeared through the trees. Several police vehicles surrounded the car, and officers ordered her to step out slowly and walk toward them without turning around. As she did, the soft banging continued behind her. Unable to stop herself, she turned and looked. On the roof of the car was the escaped man, holding her husband's severed head and repeatedly striking the car with it. Story 20. A few years ago, some friends and I took time off work to go on a road trip through the southeastern states up to Pennsylvania and back. We drove mostly at night, set up tents before dusk, slept briefly, and spent the days exploring wherever we stopped. While driving through Alabama, which we knew would be dull along the interstate, we chose a rural route instead. About 3/4 of the way through the state, traveling from south to north, we decided to stop for the morning and camp in an open field with no visible warning signs. We mostly wanted space to sleep without being cramped in the car. Around midday, we packed up and noticed a picturesque barn about 500 feet away. We walked over to explore, splitting up to look around. While I was examining tall grass near the side of the barn, one of my friends yelled. Inside, the others were standing around a trap door in the floor near the back. She said she had heard crying, which stopped when she found the door. We stood silently listening, hearing only the wind, when suddenly something slammed violently against the underside of the door. Everyone ran immediately except me. I was frozen, unable to move, my mind screaming for my legs to work. Then my body suddenly spun around and I tried to run, but everything went completely black, like a heavy blanket had been thrown over me. A childlike scream filled the darkness without pause, drowning out everything, even my own voice. I felt an icy grip in my chest and struggled to breathe, as if something had seized my heart. I flailed blindly, then forced myself to run and crashed into a low beam, knocking myself unconscious. I woke up later in the grass near my car, my eyes swollen shut with dried blood. My friends cleaned me up and told me they had heard my screaming while locked out of the car and had gone for help before returning. When they found me, I was bleeding on the barn floor and the trap door was wide open, so they dragged me out by my feet. Then one of them told me to look at the barn. What had looked new and beautiful before was now old, decayed, and falling apart. None of us spoke about it again, and for the rest of the trip, we stayed only in campgrounds or slept in the car. Story 21. This happened about 10 years ago, when I was a freshman in college. I moved into my dorm room and was the first one there, since the guy I was supposed to room with had not arrived yet. I had found out in advance who he was, and we had coordinated who would bring what before moving in. A week went by and I heard nothing from him, but I was busy learning where my classes were and getting settled, so I did not worry much. On the 8th day, I came back to the dorm from my last class and found him sitting on his bed. I walked over to say hello and immediately noticed he looked terrible. He was pale, extremely thin, and I kept my distance, worried he might be sick. I introduced myself and tried to make small talk, but he never looked at me. He only grunted or nodded, never actually speaking or acknowledging me. I also realized he had brought nothing with him. No clothes, no bags, none of the things we had agreed on. This continued for another week. Every morning I woke up, he was sitting on his bed, either asleep upright or staring into space. When I came back from class, he was still there. I never saw him eat, go to the bathroom, or leave the room. The only indication he moved at all was at night, when I would hear rustling, doors opening or closing, and occasionally some of my belongings being shifted. Being new to college, I had plenty on my mind and did not push the issue. After a few days, I noticed a smell. It was unpleasant at first, but it grew stronger with each passing day. He was still wearing the same clothes he had arrived in, and his appearance had worsened. His head drooped constantly, his eyes barely stayed open, and his skin had taken on an ashen tone. He looked like death. I tried talking to him about his health and the smell, but he did not respond at all. The odor became unbearable, and no amount of air freshener helped. I could not sleep or concentrate. After 5 days of this, I went to speak with the resident officer. I explained everything about my roommate. He looked at me strangely and told me they were still searching for a roommate for me because the one I had been assigned had dropped out. I told him there was a man in my room and that I did not know who he was. We went back together and the room was empty. The bed was rumpled and the smell of rot was overwhelming. The resident officer clearly thought I was either lying or delusional. I begged him to remove the bed and replace it. Later, I called the number I had from my roommate, and his mother answered. She recognized my voice. I told her he had been staying with me for a week and explained everything. There was silence on the line. Then her voice returned, strained and furious. She told me he had become ill about 3 weeks earlier, was hospitalized for a week, and then died when his body shut down. He had been buried that weekend. She accused me of calling to mock her grief and hung up. I never contacted her again. Story 22. When I was 9 years old, my grandfather was in the hospital suffering from bone cancer and diabetes. As his condition worsened, my visits became less frequent, until one day I was told I was no longer allowed to see him. I never fully understood why, but he was my favorite person in the world, and I was his, and I believe my family wanted to protect my memories of him. One day, while I was playing at my mother's friend's house, and the rest of my family was at the hospital, I was suddenly overcome with a powerful and unfamiliar feeling. I stopped what I was doing and slowly walked into the kitchen, where my mother's friend was preparing snacks. She looked at me with concern and asked what was wrong, but I could not look at her. My eyes were fixed on the phone hanging on the wall, and in a voice that did not feel like my own, I said that the phone was going to ring and that the person on the other end would say my grandfather had just died. I stood there for a moment, then walked outside through an open door. As I stepped into the yard, I heard the phone ring sharply behind me. I went to the swing set and began swinging slowly, alone. After a few minutes, I looked up and saw my mother's friend standing in the doorway, crying and staring at me in shock. I simply smiled at her. Story 23. I am using a throwaway account because I have only ever told my wife this story and never anyone else. And I do not know why I feel embarrassed about it, but I have never wanted extra attention from friends about something like this. If someone told me this, I probably would not believe them either, so I understand skepticism. I have always hoped it was nothing more than a horrible coincidence, but it has disturbed me for years. On the night of September 10th, 2001, I had several extremely vivid dreams, the kind where you are half awake and almost daydreaming. In the first dream, I do not remember how it started, but I saw an airplane crash into a massive metal structure with many windows. At first I thought it was a train, but that did not make sense because it was upright instead of lying flat. I then heard screams so realistic that they woke me up. I was sweating and panicked, and it took me about an hour to calm down enough to fall asleep again. When I did, I had the exact same dream again, waking up at the same moment to the same horrifying screams. And this time, it took me almost 2 hours to fall asleep because I was deeply unsettled by having the identical dream twice in one night. When I finally fell asleep again, I had a third dream where people were flying freely through the air, not in planes, but with their arms stretched out, smiling and enjoying themselves. Suddenly, all at once, they stopped and began to fall, screaming in terror, and I could see their faces clearly as they fell. I woke up again to the sound of screaming and barely slept for the rest of the night. The next morning, I slept in since I was in college and only had late classes, And around 9:30, my girlfriend called me to tell me that a plane had crashed into the World Trade Center. I had never really seen the towers before, so I turned on the television without knowing what I was about to witness. Everything from my dreams the night before seemed to converge into that single moment, and it was horrifying. I am being completely honest and have not exaggerated anything. I wish it were not true. The experience disturbed me so deeply that I could not finish the semester and ended up failing and dropping most of my classes, even though it was my senior year and I was preparing to graduate. I have tried for years to move past it, but I still struggle with guilt and recurring nightmares. Story 24. My grandmother always said that her mother was a terrible person and rarely spoke about her, and when she did, she referred to her as a witch. When my grandmother and her siblings were young, they lived in a small shack in Arkansas, a tiny 2 or 3 room house isolated in the countryside. My grandmother said her mother would have people over at strange hours of the night, doing unsettling things behind closed doors. One night, while my grandmother, her sisters, and her brother were sitting together in the main room, their mother was in her room with several people when suddenly she screamed. The door burst open, and my grandmother's grandmother, who had died a few weeks earlier, stepped into the room. Her appearance was wrong, her features distorted like a twisted cartoon version of herself. She crossed the room quickly, grabbed my grandmother, who was around 8 years old at the time, by the hand and told her to come with her, trying to drag her toward the front door. My grandmother's mother screamed for her not to go, insisting that the thing was not really her grandmother. My grandmother never finished that story properly, and there were other dark things she hinted at, including once saying her mother had sold her to a man when she was a child, though she never explained further. Years later, when my mother was young, she lived briefly with her sister in an old farmhouse in McMinnville, Oregon, a white 2-story house sitting alone in a wheat field near the forest. The house constantly creaked, footsteps and voices could be heard when no one was there, and animals refused to enter it. My mother always felt something was wrong with the layout, especially the space between her room and the next, which felt too large for the house. Eventually, the house was torn down, and during demolition, a hidden hallway was discovered between those rooms, leading to a small chamber containing an old chair facing the wall and a disturbing painting of Satan. The remains of the house were burned. Years later, I lived in the new house built near that spot, and nothing strange happened. But after that house was also removed and a manufactured home placed directly on the original foundation, unsettling events began again. My grandmother also once told me about walking to school with her siblings when they encountered a large snake crossing the road. Her brother threw a rock at it, and the snake shattered into pieces like glass, then continued on its way as if nothing had happened. Something I later discovered was known as a shatter snake. One experience happened directly to me when I was very young, living in a house in Fresno, California. My sisters complained of footsteps and scratching sounds in the attic above one bedroom, and one night I slept there to prove nothing was wrong, only to be woken by heavy movement and scratching above my head. Months later, a kitten became trapped in the attic vent above the front door, and my father sent me into the attic through a hatch in my sister's closet to retrieve it. As I turned around, I came face to face with a massive dog-like creature crouched silently inches from me, staring without blinking. I dropped the kitten, fell out of the attic, and fled the house, staying away for weeks. Months later, after my father accidentally fired a gun into the ceiling, he heard a howl of pain and saw a large brown dog-like creature burst from my sister's room and run out the front door. Neighbors reported seeing something strange fleeing the house, and damage was found in the closet and attic. That was the last of it. But my family has many other stories like these, and I will leave it there. Story 25. This is absolutely true, and even though it does not align with my personal beliefs, I believe my dad. He told this story only to my mom and no one else, and when I later asked him to confirm it, he said it really happened, but did not want to talk about it further. For context, I am almost completely certain my dad is an atheist, a very logical and skeptical person, and according to him, the only reason he believes in ghosts at all is because he has seen them. He works for an airline and travels constantly, often staying in small hotels near airports, and he believes this happened when he was in St. Louis. He was lying in bed after turning off the television, the door locked, not yet asleep but drifting toward it, while it was cold and raining outside. Suddenly he heard a sound near the door and looked over to see a young girl, around 8 to 10 years old, standing there in a nightgown, soaking wet and shivering. He said she did not look misty or unreal in any way, but like a real child, pale and freezing. He was startled at first, but also felt an overwhelming sense that she simply did not want to be cold. He lay completely frozen as she walked around the bed, out of his sight, and then felt her slip under the covers behind him and curl up against his back. He was too terrified to move or speak, so he shut his eyes and waited for morning. When he woke up, she was gone. The door was still locked, and the sheets behind him were damp at chest level, not in a way that could be explained by anything else. He never told anyone except my mom, and only my brother and I know, because she eventually told us. My dad has other strange stories from when he was younger, but he treats them like old war stories and avoids discussing them. He has never been the type to exaggerate or lie, and even though I do not believe in the supernatural, this story still makes me uneasy when I am alone in the dark. Story 26. When I was 6 and my brother was 8, we shared a bedroom in a townhome with a shared wall, and strange things happened there that we mostly blamed on our imagination. We even invented an imaginary friend, a black widow spider that lived in the corner by the door and supposedly came out at night. One evening as we were trying to fall asleep, we started hearing loud pounding coming from the wall. After letting it go on for a while, we screamed for our mom, who came in disheveled and asked what was wrong. We told her about the banging, but as soon as she entered the room, it stopped, and she said it was probably just the wind, which made sense since it was monsoon season in Arizona. She said she would check on us later and left. That night was stressful for her, as she was in the middle of breaking up with her boyfriend over serious personal issues, so unexplained noises were not her priority. Less than 5 minutes after she left, the pounding started again, louder and closer. I screamed and ran into the living room, where I found my mom standing defensively with tears streaming down her face while her boyfriend looked furious. He made an angry sound and stormed out, then sat in his car outside, leaning on the horn before finally driving away. My mom locked the door, the bolt, and the chain, then brought me back to the bedroom, where my brother said the pounding stopped as soon as I ran out. She stayed with us until we fell asleep. The next morning, she woke us early and sat us down, something she never did, and told us there had been an attempted break-in. Our doorknob was damaged and the bolt lock had scrape marks on it, and police were outside. The neighbor's home had been completely emptied overnight while their children happened to be staying elsewhere. When we were brought over, we saw why the police were focused on the living room. The wall shared with our bedroom had a massive indentation, several feet wide and deeply gouged. The intruders had tried to break through our wall instead of the door, not realizing our unit had a solid brick exterior wall because it had been added later than the others. They had spent hours pounding on it when they could have easily forced entry elsewhere. After that night, my mom never again told us a strange noise was just the wind. Story 27. I went to boarding school, so there were plenty of creepy stories floating around about things that happened there, most of which were fairly tame, like students messing with Ouija boards, and the school later receiving an angry phone call from the local Wiccan community telling them to stop. But sometimes the stories were much stranger. The junior and senior boys' dormitory was called upper school, and sometime in the early 20th century, a student had taken his own life by hanging himself in one of the rooms. Since then, the dorm has had a reputation for being haunted, to the point where there is an unofficial challenge to spend an entire night alone in the room where it happened. Over the years, a number of students who lived in that room reported the same experience, waking up in the middle of the night, usually around 3 in the morning, fully conscious but completely unable to move, describing it as feeling as though someone was lying on top of them. Only one person I know of ever attempted to stay in upper school alone for the night. She went to bed normally but woke suddenly at 3 in the morning to the sound of a door opening and closing and soft footsteps moving down the hallway. Assuming someone was playing a prank, she opened her door and looked out into the hall, but no one was there, so she returned to bed. Later, she woke again with the overwhelming feeling that someone was watching her, and once more she heard the door and the footsteps. This time she stepped fully into the hallway, and the moment she did, The door to the room slammed shut behind her. Terrified, she ran out of the building. When she returned the next day with a faculty member, they were unable to open the door because every piece of furniture in the room had been pushed up against it.